And thanks, Alex. Hi, everybody. I am Ashley, and Macalester is a small liberal arts school. It's undergrad only. It's in St. Paul, Minnesota, so I'll be seeing you all next year when NACIS is in Minneapolis. I want to talk about a project I did that was inspired by work that has been presented here at NACIS, but also just some of the cool cartographic products that have been put out in the last few years. And I started to think, I think I want to do that with a class in a semester. My department thought I was insane, but it was a really fun class, and I want to share the process with you a little bit. So the class was called Cultural Atlas Production. There were a total of 16 undergraduate students and 2 undergrad TAs. We are an undergrad-only institution. 10 of those students had no previous design software experience at all. Most were not local to the St. Paul area. And we had a lot of different majors and disciplines. They weren't all geographers. The only common factor here was that I made them all be sure to have Intro GIS. And really the only reason I required that was because I wanted them to have a platform to fall back on, not knowing design software. So our semesters are 15 weeks. We used 157 data sources. We worked with 24 experts or interviewees. We had 21 softwares, apps, tools, resources that we used, and those are probably low estimates. This is the class here. You can check out the atlas is online, and I've also circulated a few copies around if you want to catch them. So the charge was make a 2-page spread. So each student was responsible for a 2-page spread in the atlas. So some examples just to give you a sense of what do these look like. That was the charge. So you had to have some sort of spatial component to your data because we are in a cartography class, so it had to be able to be mapped in some way. But otherwise, they could do whatever they wanted, pretty much, as long as they could make a case. So we talked about what makes places special. What is your experience with a place? And this led to a lot of different discussions about what stories we wanted to include. How do we represent as a group of people who aren't necessarily locals and who are transient, right? They are undergrads who are there for 4 years and then they leave. How can we have ownership over these stories? How can we really tell the story of St. Paul and give it its fair due? So we had a lot of different discussions about the different topics we included, and I'll share some of those with you. But I told each student they had to pick a focus, right? You can't do everything in a 13-week timeline because we had 15 weeks total, but it was spring semester. So half of them were graduating, and I needed to get this printed atlas in their hands. So that meant we lost a week and a half to the print run, right? So we really only had about 13 weeks to get it to the printer. So I said, you can focus kind of on primary data collection. Do you want to focus on storytelling? What do you want to get out of this assignment? What do you want to practice? Data wrangling or processing was also a common one. And then some students really focused on merging design interests and their academic interests. I did require them to do some field work, and they recorded this with these process journals. So this is just an example of what a student would turn in to me. They had about 3 of these, and it was basically a check-in. What have you done so far? What do you know so far? What do you have left to do? And how's it going, kind of thing. So, for example, one student did a close read of a memoir by a local Hmong author about her migration from Laos to Minnesota, and she visited the Hmong Museum, the Eastside Freedom Library, which houses the Hmong archives, and interviewed some Hmong activists and community leaders. The design inspiration here was of a Hmong story cloth, and so we really tried to stay true to the stories, and though Elston is not Hmong herself, she really tried to portray everything in an accurate way and get feedback from community members so that she was really staying true to Kyla's experience. So Another example would be to actually go out and do kind of site visit field work. So taking GPS points, visiting historical archives, and you can see Maggie here down on the corner doing her historical archive research at the Minnesota Historical Society. This is one of my favorite data collection stories. It's this young student, Stella, she went year by year through St. Paul City directories and hand recorded from 1903 to 1920 every single Chinese restaurant in the city of St. Paul. And then she realized that that was taking a really long time. So she sped up a little bit and went decade by decade after 1920. We used a lot of data sources. I required them to do a formal lit review of their topic, so they did have to have pretty in-depth citations. Some works used more primary data collection, but it was for that background content to try and tell an accurate story. So as a part of the process journal, they also had to show me, how are you exploring your data, right? Like, we don't know what our data really say right away, so what are you doing to explore it? This is Katie Jollies, and I'm going to put her on the spot. She is sitting right there, and you can talk to her afterwards if you're interested. But she is an R wizard and was able to produce a lot of different charts and maps and graphs while she was exploring her data set. So this is an example of kind of the process of how some of the design and aesthetic. This was another conversation we had a lot, was in a non-traditional map, when you're not just saying, where are things, but you're saying, what is the story of this place? How is it linked together? How do you take a kind of traditional cartographic method and make it more personal? How do you show that what you're mapping isn't just where things are or the boundaries of things, but you're actually showing something that is very personal to a lot of people? So we talked about the aesthetics and how to represent things. So you can see her sketches here and different things. So trying to kind of bridge these mediums of artistry and mapping. I also required them to experiment with something they didn't know. So most people learned 6 or 7 or 8 things that they didn't know already. So this was not a hard criteria to meet. But basically I said, don't let what you don't know limit what you do, right? Tell me what you want to do and we'll figure out a way to make it happen. So I didn't teach any one particular technology. Most students ended up using Illustrator for at least some of the work, but some people chose to use Inkscape, and then they smattered together other platforms like R, Excel, Canva, raw graphs. A lot of different techniques went into this, and then we brought them all together later. And then, of course, ArcMap or QGIS. So one of the really interesting pieces that happened in this class was Macalester has a pretty good reputation of thinking about and being reflective about our position in society. Who are we? What are we bringing to the table? What are our own biases? So I did include a class period where we were going to talk about that. But positionality took on a life of its own with this project. This was very important to the class to tell stories that we did not have ownership over. It was a largely white class, but we didn't want to leave out stories that are important to St. Paul and important for people to hear. So we tried to include, this is a map representing important places to the Dakota people, and the Dakota people are and were the stewards of the land where we live in St. Paul. So one way to combat that was to have no settler infrastructure or boundaries on the map. The other thing we did was to kind of force people to rethink what it meant to see St. Paul, because Lakota, Dakota, Nakota maps are usually southern oriented. So we have a little note over here on the right-hand side that's with north facing up, and it's a note to settlers. And then you flip the map over, and all of the labels have south at the top. So and a little note about the meaning behind each place. The other way we tried to tell who we were and what we brought to the table and what we weren't bringing was to give each student an opportunity to give themselves a little bio. Who am I? Where do I come from? Who helped me along this way? Even a little chance to talk about their process a little bit. So on the top here we have that's what a spread would look like. So they had each had a little bio there. And then we also wrote an introduction to kind of frame it and say, this is, this is our version of St. Paul. It may not be your version. It's not an exhaustive history. It's not all-inclusive, and it's not meant to be. And we want you to discover your own St. Paul, tell your own stories. This over here is a piece we put together for our launch party so that each person would you could put a face with a spread, hear about their process and their data sources and stuff. We want to be transparent. They had to make 3 versions. So we had a first draft, and that was just, we went over content. Do you have everything you need? What's missing? What could be cut? Kind of refining that storytelling process. The second draft, we made sure the story made sense, but then we focused more on aesthetics and does the design make sense? Does the design helping you tell that story? And then of course you have the final version for the printer. Then we had to put it all together, and believe it or not, this was the most challenging part. People had very strong opinions about what their spread was representing and how it related to the other spreads, and oh my goodness. So our class periods was an hour and a half, and we actually had to go into a second class period. So I had set aside one being like, this will be fine. And they were like, no, we don't want to organize it, to the point where I almost abandoned the idea of having chapters. I was like, let's just call it a day. I'm just going to randomly stick them in there and call it good. And then, of course, we had to name the chapters, and that was like a whole nother day. So that was more trouble than I thought. And then, of course, we split up all the publishing roles. So creating the cover art, the chapter separators, title page, dedications, about the authors, all of that stuff. My role was to just put it all together, create the final InDesign file to send to the printer. So we are going to try it again next spring, see if this is actually a repeatable process. So I'll let you know next year when you're in Minneapolis, because our subject is going to be Minneapolis. So since we did one Twin City, we want to do the other now. So thank you so much, and let me know if you have questions.